So this video is going to be about who are your friends as a believer in the Messiah. It's going to be about who you should have fellowship with and who you should reject, because a Christian church which is turned to the ways of the heathen, they welcome everybody's religion, they welcome everything. You'll see churches that are doing Quran studies, you'll see churches that are doing other festivals, you see Catholic schools that are celebrating all religions, and we know for a fact that that's not what God commanded at all. So to start off, Matthew 12, verse 46 through 50. While he yet talked with the people, behold, his mother and his brethren stood without, desiring to speak to him. Then one said unto him, Behold, thy mother and thy brethren stand without, desiring to speak with thee. But he answered and said unto him that told him, Who is my mother, and who are my brethren? And he stretched forth his hand toward his disciples, and said, Behold, my mother and my brethren. For whosoever shall do the will of God which is in heaven, the same is my mother, sister, and and mother. So that basically means that you can only, well, your friends as a believer, like your brethren, like the ones who you're supposed to be with in Yeshua Messiah, are those who do the will of God and obey it, who hear the word of God and obey it,
Right.
and go
So
on
like
to
the people who are keeping the Ten Commandments, they're actually doing the will of God. Those are your true brethren in the Messiah. If someone's breaking the Ten Commandments on purpose, well, then they're not really a brother in truth. They're just a brother by name only. So you shouldn't be calling them as such and, fellowshipping with them.
right. John 15, verse 15 to 17. Yeshua says to his disciples, Henceforth I call not ye not servants, for the servant knoweth not what his Lord doeth. But I have called you friends, for all things that I have heard of my Father I have made known to you. You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit, and your fruit should remain, that whatsoever you shall ask in my Father's name, he may give it to you. These things I have commanded you, that ye love one another. So to break that down, if you're a friend of Yeshua, you're going to be bearing fruit,
Right.
and
And
also you're going to
bearing
love one another.
correct. And that's actually related because loving your neighbor as yourself, loving one another, it means to keep each other in check and to rebuke them when you see them go in sin. That's quoting Leviticus 19, verses 17 and 18. So bearing fruit, that's very related. We're going to get to this, but Ephesians 5, the fruits of the Spirit is to reprove the sin out of the church. So the people bearing fruit, the people fulfilling the royal law to love your neighbor as yourself, those are the true brethren,
Right.
right? And then next we're going to go to 1 Corinthians 5. So this will explain a little bit between the differences between unbelievers and believers. So Paul says right here, verse 9, I wrote unto you in an epistle not to company with fornicators, yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or with idolaters, for then must ye needs go out of the world. But now I have written unto you not to keep company if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner. With such a one, no, not to eat. For what have I to do? For what have I to do to judge them also that are without the church? Do not ye judge them that are within? But them that are without, God judgeth. Therefore put away from among yourselves that wicked person. So he's saying, don't, if someone calls themselves a believer, a brother in the Messiah, don't just be hanging out with them if they're doing these sins like idolatry, or they're being a drunkard or an extortioner or a railer, or they're covetous. If they're doing any of these sins or anything like them, then don't even eat with them, basically, is what it's saying. And it says in other spots to even like shame them, I'm pretty sure, because if they're trying to be a follower of the Messiah, don't just promote their sin, actually like, show them that what they're doing is wrong. That's what you're supposed to do. But what this is not saying is to do that with every single person in the world, because there are unbelievers, and that's most of the world. And those people, well, you kind of have to go out of the world to completely stay away from all of them. So, like, if you have an unbelieving family member, an unbelieving like boss or someone that you have to work with, you're not supposed to treat them the same way as a believer who claims to be a brother and does these sins. So the point is, if they're doing like idolatry or if they're being covetous, any of those things mentioned, they're not doing the will of God, then you have to separate yourself from them. So now we got 1 Corinthians 15. So then Ephesians 5. So this is somewhat related. I mean, all these are, of course, but Ephesians 5, I'm going to start in verse 9 here. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness and righteousness and truth, proving what is acceptable unto the Lord, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful darkness, or sorry, the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. So have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. This is the fruits of the Spirit, as I just mentioned in verse 9. People seem to forget that the fruits of the Spirit is also in Ephesians 5 and not just Galatians. But part of that is to have no fellowship with darkness, but rather expose the truth about it, reprove their sin. That's the fruits. You bring forth fruit by teaching the true gospel and rebuking the sin out of the church. So it's the same thing. Don't be fellowshipping with all these idolaters, basically. And this is what the church is doing today. They're doing Christmas, Easter, Sun God Day, all these man-made traditions and days for other gods. So don't be partakers with that sort of community. Instead, teach against it, teach against those lies, like expose that it's all pagan stuff that God says not to do, traditions of men that the Messiah warns you about in Mark chapter 7. So let's see what else we got. Think you're up next, Bible Thumper?
Yep. Titus 3, verse 10 and 11, KJV. A man that is an heretic after the first and second admonition reject, knowing that he that is such is subverted and sinneth, being condemned of himself. So you're supposed to give them, if they're believers, that is, or if they claim the name of a brother, you have to give them at least one or two warnings. And after that, if they continue in their sin and they're not even going to repent of it, then you might as well, it just says to leave them. Even Yeshua says this when he says, let them alone. The blind lead the blind. They're going to fall into a ditch, right?
Right.
Going on.
After the first and second admonition, so, don't just keep going with the same person. Like a lot of our brothers, sometimes they'll make the error of they just keep going on the same person, like keep rebuking the same person over and over and over and over, and they're still not getting anywhere. Like after a certain point, you got to cut it off and just be like, okay, this guy isn't getting it. I'm gonna go find someone else who does want to listen, and then you just stop partaking with them, stop like fellowshipping or talking with them. That's what you're supposed to be doing. Call them a heretic, basically. Treat them as if you're not supposed to be with them anymore.
Yep, treat them as you would a publican or a sinner.
No, no, I will say there is one exception, and that's if like it's a known terror. This is basically what they are. Like if they keep being rebellious to the truth, they're called like tares. The Messiah has the parable of the tares versus the wheat. The wheat bow down, they're humble, they want the truth, but the tares they stand up tall and proud. They're sown in by the enemy. So these people that are rebellious, they're sown in by the enemy, and there's an exception, like if you want to rebuke them in front of other believers to expose their lies, back to the fruits of the spirit again. Like if there's this one really popular account on Twitter and, obviously they're not there for the truth, they just want a lot of followers, you can rebuke them there and maybe other people will see it. So that's kind of what Paul was doing as well. When he would go and rebuke the Jewish synagogues, then the other people would see him rebuke them.
Right?
So,
They that sin rebuke before all, so that others may also fear. Titus.
yeah.
And then 1 Corinthians 10, verse 20 to 21. But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. I would not that you have fellowship with devils. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partaker of the Lord's table and the table of devils. I mean, this is pretty clear, don't be a partaker in the idolatry of the Gentiles, and don't have fellowship with them unless you're in these situations in the world where we can't escape it and we have forced to interact with these people, right? But if you're choosing to go out of your way and do this and not even like preaching to them, you're just hanging out with unbelievers, you're just getting drunk with the drunken,
Right.
right?
So some people what they might do, and they even did this with Saturnalia. Some of the early Christians, they tried to use Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 9 to say like, oh, we're just trying to gain over the unbelievers. We're going to go do these idolatrous festivals with them. But no, that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to relate to them in other ways than that you're participating in idolatry with them. So have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Don't be partakers with devils, people who are worshiping devils. Instead, come out of the world, and that's going to be the next verse Bible Thumper reads here.
Yep. Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore shall be a friend of the world is an enemy of God.
Right?
And
Yeah.
that's
So
just
don't,
really clear, isn't it?
yeah, don't just be like fellowshipping with all these worldly ways like Christmas, Easter, Halloween. Like that's all just ways of the world. It's not biblical. It's just stuff that the Gentiles invented. And when I say Gentile, I mean that's basically just the same word that means nation. So it's stuff that the nations invented, meaning it's of the world and it's not of God. Because as believers, we're supposed to be grafted into Israel and be spiritual Israelites and no longer be of the world. So don't be born of this world, be born of God, come out of the world and don't do all their worldly ways and their festivals. You're like, oh, I want to go do this thing Saturday night. Well, no, you got to keep the Sabbath day instead because that's one of the Ten Commandments. So we're supposed to be a holy, peculiar people. Don't just be in the ways of the world. Come out of them. All right.
Yep.
You have anything else to say there? I might have cut you off.
No, I was just gonna add one more thing in Deuteronomy 12, where it says, "These are the statutes and judgments which ye shall observe to do in the land which the Lord God of thy fathers giveth thee to possess it, all the days that thee live upon the earth. Ye shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations which ye have possessed other served other gods upon the high mountains and upon the hills and upon under every green tree. Ye shall overthrow their altars, break their pillars, and burn their groves with fire. And ye shall hew down the graven images of their gods and destroy the names of them out of the place." Right? So I mean it's pretty clear how it's telling you not to have association with them or their gods, right? When obviously we're not going to do that in captivity in their own land. We're not going to go throwing down graven images and start, rebuking them and all that. But when you're in the promised land, according to prophecy, that's when you're going to go do that.
Right. Yeah. When we're outside the land, we're supposed to rebuke the other believers and tell them to stop doing this stuff. But only when you're in the inheritance, you can actually start like breaking down like the altars and idols and the graven images and stuff like that. But yeah, that's a really good verse to show Deuteronomy 12 in general is like the first few verses, the last few verses to show that we're not supposed to be trying to use ways of the world, all these pagan customs to try to worship God. So Christmas, Easter, all that stuff, that's not how you honor God. You have to honor him the way that he commands you. So don't do it in a worldly way. Do it in the way that God sanctifies. What did he sanctify? Well, for one, he sanctified the Sabbath day, but most believers ignore that for whatever reason. Obviously, because of Satan. He's convinced believers. He's infiltrated the churches, and that's why we need to reprove them. So I guess that leads us up to our next point. So Second John chapter 1, 'cause there's only one chapter, verses 10 and 11. Um, I'm not in the right. Give me a sec. All right. So I'm just going to start on verse 9 actually. So whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ hath not God. He that abideth in the doctrine of Christ, he hath both the Father and the Son. If there come any unto you and bring not this doctrine, receive him not into your house, neither bid him God speed. For he that biddeth him God speed is partaker of his evil deeds. So again, don't just be like accepting people into your house that are claiming to be believers and then they don't believe the doctrine of Christ at all. They're believing these worldly ways, this false satanic doctrine of, once saved, always saved, tolerate sin in the church, do all these pagan festivals, don't keep the Ten Commandments, be lawless. Like that's the kind of stuff that you're not supposed to be tolerating. Because if you are, well, then you're basically saying, I'm okay with your sin, even though I would rather you be this way. So like think of it like this. If you have another believer, what their situation in is if they're doing all those sins, they have a truck coming right towards them. And instead of, trying to say, hey, get out of the road, you're saying you're just like holding your hand next to them and they're about to get hit and you're just okay with them doing that. Like that's not how it's supposed to be. If they're doing grave error that's going to send them to hell, act like it. Act like, you need to move. I'm not going to support this. So that's what we're trying to get at right there. Then,
Yeah. I just wanted to add one thing, that truck that's coming towards them, it's gonna hit you as well if you continue on supporting them. God's gonna make sure of it that you're gonna be a partaker of their evil deed, and it's gonna hit you as well.
exactly, you're going to be a partaker of their evil deeds. That's really what the royal law is as well. Rebuke your neighbor so you don't suffer sin because of them. Because if you see your neighbor, specifically another believer, your brother, committing sin and you don't say anything, you're partaker of their evil deeds. So you'll be hit with the truck with them. That's why it also says in Revelation 18, verse 4, come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins. So, don't be fellowshipping or you're going to go to the same place with them. Right? So I think we had one more little passage here, and this is 2 Corinthians chapter 6. I'm going to start in verse 14. So it says, be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God, as God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. So very clear right there. Don't just continue to be friends with these people who, they hate God, they don't want anything to do with him. Don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. So be separate, come out of the world, be a holy, peculiar people who obeys the commandments of the Lord and wants to seek righteousness and not just friendship with the world. Do you want to add anything before we end this Bible thumper?
No, I think that's about it. I think we covered everything.
All right. So yeah, maybe just to sum up, don't be partakers with unbelievers. And if anyone calls themselves a brother, but they're not doing the will of God, they're doing idolatry, they're breaking the Ten Commandments, then don't fellowship with those guys either. But be fellowshipping with the true believers who are fulfilling the royal law, who are keeping the Ten Commandments, and who actually have a heart for God. Don't be, partaking with lukewarm believers who basically, they act as the world. And if you actually are looking for any sort of fellowship, I do have a website linked on this YouTube channel, and I could post it in the description or comments or whatever as well if you want to ask. But straightasthegate.net, we have Zoom meetings every Sabbath day, so please join that if you are seeking a group of people who actually follows the biblical uh, way of truth. And then, well, you can hang out with us there instead of with all these churches that are lying about the gospel and preaching ear-tickling fables. So I think that's what we got.